right, everyone, it is 3:03, so we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome, and thank you guys for attending our Global Change Seminar today. My name is Kathryn Jewell, and I'm a master's student at North Carolina State University and a Global Change Fellow at the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. The Southeast CASC is one of several adaptation science centers hosted at select institutions across the United States and funded by the U.S. Geological Survey. CASC centers across the United States work with natural and cultural resource managers to gather scientific information and build tools needed to help fish, wildlife, and ecosystems adapt to the impacts of changing climate and wildlife use. And if you'd like to learn more about these CASC centers, you can visit their website that Kate just dropped in the chat. So co-hosting with me today are Hemant, Kate, and Justine. And today we've convened a multidisciplinary panel to discuss intergenerational learning and its impacts on communities. So joining us today are Dr. Danielle Lawson, Dr. Kathryn Stevenson, Dr. Casey Bush, and Ms. Norma Ortiz. So I'll read a brief bio from our speakers, and then I'll let them chime in with anything that I missed, and let the audience know who you are. So we'll first start with Dr. Danielle Lawson. Dr. Lawson is an assistant professor in the Recreation, Park, and Tourism Management Department at Pennsylvania State University. She received her Ph.D. in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management from NC State in 2019, as well as a double master's degree in the Environmental Education and Coastal Management from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington in 2015. Dr. Lawson's research has focused on a variety of topics, including how intergenerational learning can impact climate change concern in the agricultural communities of North Carolina, agroforestry in Belize, environmental education, as well as social justice. And she was also a Global Change Fellow once upon a time. Anything else to add, Danielle?
Nope, that did it. Thanks, Kathryn.
All right, and next we have Dr. Kathryn Stevenson. Dr. Stevenson is an assistant professor in the Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Department at North Carolina State University. Her research and teaching focuses on environmental education and her research around similar topics of children and nature. She is interested in both the benefits that time outside can provide to children, as well as how children can provide unique and powerful voices in their communities around environmental challenges. Germane to this panel, Dr. Stevenson has focused on child to adult intergenerational learning, with a particular interest in how child-led communications may activate universal values among diverse groups of adults, inviting them to think outside the political and ideological boundaries that usually divide us. So welcome, Dr. Stevenson.
Thanks.
Next, we have Dr. Casey Bush. Dr. Bush is an assistant professor of STEM education at North Carolina State University, specializing in informal science learning and affiliated with the Leadership and Public Science Interdisciplinary Cluster. Her long-term career goal is to explore and advance educational experiences that empower individuals to engage in collective action to improve their lives and their communities. Drawing on research from the fields of science communication and environmental psychology, Dr. Bush has investigated the language used to teach about climate change in educational settings and how that framing affects youth perception of the problem and their capacity for creating solutions.
Nothing to add. Thanks.
Awesome. And finally, we've got Mrs. Norma Ortiz. She's a co-author on a project with Dr. Dominique David Chavez in intergenerational research on indigenous agricultural knowledge, climate resilience, and food security in the Caribbean. She has a bachelor's degree in education from the University of Puerto Rico, as well as a master's degree in school counseling from the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico. Norma worked in a physical education for 5 years and was a school counselor for 25 years. She's currently retired and volunteers with her community working with kids, youth, and elders in Sidra, Puerto Rico. So I'm super excited all you guys are here today. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart as well. So let's just go ahead. For those in the audience who may or may not know what intergenerational learning is, can someone provide just like a brief definition and discussion and why it's important in broader context?
Do you want to take that one, Kathryn, or should I? Or
Why don't you go for it, Danielle?
Okay, so the easiest way to describe intergenerational learning is just really to have people reflect on their experiences. One of my favorite things to give an example with is anyone in here in the audience who would define themselves as a millennial, probably, cell phones have been a big part of our lives. And I'm sure we all have had the experiences, myself included, where we have parents who are like, how do I use this? And you're having to show them how to use your cell phone, their cell phone. So that is intergenerational learning. It can also happen the opposite direction. Our parents, people in the community that we live in, elders, they all teach us something, and it's this movement of information back and forth. It can be knowledge, like I said, how to use a cell phone, but it can also be knowledge about things like climate change. It can be attitudes, and it can relate to behaviors as well. The thing that's really neat about it is that, we learn through interactions with people, but it really focuses on these differences between generations. And without giving away too much and taking away too much thunder from anyone else on the panel, that there's this really unique opportunity when you have younger generations interacting with older generations to really have influence and impact on topics that tend to be really difficult to have conversations about. Climate change, of course, that's why most of us are here, being one of those examples.
Awesome, thank you. All right, anyone please chime in whenever you have answers, So starting off, what are some of the challenges associated with intergenerational learning regarding the transfer of knowledge from elders to children or vice versa from children to parents? And Ms. Ortiz, could you start us off here?
Yes, of course. For me, the language between generation, sometimes the elders doesn't understand the youngest language or vice versa. They have right now some difficult permit with the generation because young people usually are in phone, or iPhone or computer. In our generation, I want to talk about this because when you have a family or community meeting, everybody participates, and it was a real generation learning. But right now, it's more difficult because young and children dedicate too much time to the technology. But for example, right now, the composition, also family composition, are changing. There's more divorced parents, and then sometimes they lost the exposition with both family, father's family, mother family. In our study that we made in Sidra with Dr. Dominic Chavez, David Chavez, we don't have too much problem to do this because we talk with both generations about the importance to learn from each other. We get together with the parents, elders, teachers, and children, and we explain then the importance to learn from each other. We made a lot of activity with them together. We plant together. We plant yuccas. We plant corn in their school. The community, the teacher, the children's. And then we have the intergenerational learning together because we explain the importance to take care of it. And all the communities, sometimes the teachers go and check the garden that we did, the plants. Sometimes the student have to go to every day to see how it was growing. If they have to clean, they clean it. Sometimes the grandparents go to the school, and then we have a good intergenerational learning in the school. Any more questions? But what was very interesting, it was they at least they have the harvest of the, for example, yuca, cassava. You know what yuca is, right? Cassava?
I personally don't know what it is, so I may not be alone.
But you know what corn is, right?
Yeah.
So they plant corn and they take the harvest of the corn, and then it was very, very interesting because sometimes children talk to grandparents or elders how to do things because they have more opportunity in the technology. Technology sometimes it's also help us because they have all the news about harvest, about how to do it with the cycle moons, and they teach the parents and the elders also teach them, and it was a good experience with that community.
Awesome. And I have a follow-up question to this. And please, anyone join in. Technology, do you think it's helping the intergenerational learning, or is it hindering it? How is that?
For me, have both, because the case that was taken before, the people, the young, especially the youngest, spend too much time in the technology. And then if you go to eat together, you see everyone with technology, with their phone, and the elder talking, and the youngest was in the phone. They don't pay attention what they talk about. But for the other hands, the technology, they have the technology, and they know the latest news about the changing of climate, and then they can talk to the elder. That's news, and they can talk together. But you know, I have this question that it's technology is helping, but technology sometimes for the intergenerational learning is not help too much for me. And they have both ways for me. Another question?
So moving on, talking more about how this intergenerational learning works, and Dr. Lawson, I'd love for you to chime in here. To what extent do family dynamics have an impact on how intergenerational learning works? Have you personally seen any differences between, for example, families with divorced parents versus not?
For example, in my generation, because I live in rural area, we still intergenerational learning. We're still practicing because my parents, my child, I have one girl, it's young, and then she can sharing the knowledge that he have with my parents, and also with the community, because she's very active, but because of me, because I'm very active in the community. The youngest, the children that from for example 7, 8, 9 years old, they are changing this they are changing the point of view, because right now our generation know the importance to meet in family, and they take their time to use technology, but when it's time to meet, it's time to meeting for the family. And then, for example, in my family, I take all the technology when we are going to meet, because we're changing the knowledge with adults, with elder, with parents, with child, with children, with baby, also with the baby. And then for example, in the school, my daughter always was very active in all in science. If talking about agriculture, she was there because she had the experience. She learned by doing. I believe very, very much when you practice learning by doing, because you learn and you got this for you because you did it and you take care of it. And it's work with the generation, by the generation. Also in our past, the elder, my grandpa was respect for us, and we learned with him. We went to the rural area, we went to the farm, we went to plant with him, and we learned with him. My father also learned with him. My daughter learned with me, and it's happening in rural area. In urban, it's not too much because they don't have too much farm. They don't have they just live in houses without land to plant. Maybe they share another knowledge, but not about the care of the lands. With like island, we had to watch the climate change, because right now we have a lot of storm, a lot of hurricane, and we have to deal with it. And if our children don't know nothing about that, what's going to happen in maybe 10 or 20 years? They don't have the opportunity to survive because we are an island. For Maria, I don't know if you remember Maria, the Hurricane Maria, it was very, very, very bad for us. And because we live in a center of the island, we don't have difficult. We don't have difficult because we have plants. They destroy the planting, they destroy another fruit, but we have roots, and we can survive with roots. And we have our water, we have our water, the water that we use is from our community, not from the government. Our system, we have our water system, and we take care of it. And because of it, we don't suffer. Yeah? But we have to teach them. We have to use the intergenerational learning to make that the youngest, the children, know about the importance to know about the climate change. I think I'm talking too much.
Yeah, and I would just like to piggyback on that, because I think that's one spot where I can chime in. I think I'm looking at intergenerational transfer of knowledge in the more traditional sense, right, from elders to youth. I think where I think Danielle and Kathryn, the strength of their research is that it's looking at it from the other way, and it sounds like Norma's research is reciprocal. So it's interesting to think about all the different ways that this could happen. But I would say that what my research has shown is just how important these social relationships are. And so and I think some of Kathryn's research points to this as well, that when we're looking at climate change action and willingness for youth to engage in such action, that one of the major drivers of that behavior and whether or not youth are willing to engage in it are their social norms. And for youth, right, their social norms are being determined by those who are around them. And so they'll talk about the influence of their peers, but then they also talk about the influence of their parents and then teachers. Right, so this is not only a driver of like how people understand things, but it's also a driver of whether or not people take action. And I think that's the most exciting part of intergenerational learning.
I would agree with you, Casey, for sure. So what's really interesting is that I'm speaking from my research with middle school aged youth. And I'm giving that context because developmentally they're different than high school aged youth and so on and so forth. But what we found, which has kind of been really promising and really neat, is that at that age, they seem to be really relying on their peers, like Casey mentioned, for those social norms and how they think about things. And that's really important when it comes to climate change perceptions. I mean, we don't just think about knowledge when we form our, like how much knowledge or scientific information we know when we form our opinions on things. We rely on our social norms, politics, worldviews, you name it. We use all of that to form our opinions on that information. But what's been really neat is some of the research that I have done, and Kathryn, I think you've done other research as well that has shown similar findings, is that children's views of climate change end up being pretty independent of their parents' views. So a parent may feel a way about climate change, but if a child is getting the information about climate change, they may not be forming views that are directly reflecting their parents, which is hopeful when we think about the fact that a lot of times adults tend to be difficult to change when it comes to how they think and feel about climate change, because of what I mentioned. We're not just using scientific knowledge to form those opinions. We're using things like our gender identity, our life experiences, politics, and those aren't levers that you can change about somebody. You can give them as much information as you want about climate change, but if they're using those things to filter the information through, that definitely is it's just a lot harder thing to change. And going back to your question about divorced parents, Kathryn, I can't say I personally haven't done any research on that. I know, Norma, you were mentioning some of the experiences that you've seen with divorced families, which is really neat to hear about. But, you know, now the research I'm getting into is looking more at these family dynamics. At what level do they have an impact on children? Is it parent and child attunement? How do parents' views of adult-child relationships have an influence on how intergenerational learning is going to occur? And then there's another part of it that, why I really enjoy, Norma, your perspective on this panel, is that we're just beginning to kind of understand how this works in other cultural contexts. A lot of it is that I hypothesize that it's not that intergenerational learning had this other curriculum behind it that figured out this magic solution and it was able to impact people in a way that we hadn't seen before. But I think it's rather that you're putting the information in the hands of youth who understand their own family's cultural context. Just like when I speak to my family, my parents and my in-laws, for example, I talk about climate change very differently with my parents than I would my in-laws. And that is everything to do with politics. My parents are Costa Rican and they're going to think about it differently than a very American perspective. And so there's some cultural translation that's happening on the behalf of a child because they understand that context in a way that anyone on this panel is never going to understand. I know, Kathryn, you've seen some of that stuff, right? So.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of what I can add here because you guys are all hitting a lot of points that that resonate with me. Danielle's making me giggle about her comment about the in-laws because that's something I share too, is understanding family context. I think that's a great point, is that I think children better than anyone can understand their own family context and how their parents are going to best engage with issues. And I think that's something that I find exciting, and I know Danielle does, is just the power, the potential power that's within that relationship that children have to be able to speak to parents in ways that in many times nobody else can. I think that I think all of these points are resonating with me, and one nuance that I'll offer as I think about Danielle's work, but then also some other emerging stuff that's coming out of our lab, is that I will kind of echo Danielle's point that we're kind of getting glimpses of these narratives that we're trying to piece together. But I think that it undoubtedly, family context shapes how kids see the world, right? And I think people know that kind of anecdotally or just from their own personal experience. But we do kind of continue to see this notion that kids can think sort of independently from their parents, which is also sort of intuitive. We all kind of, in some ways, we're exactly like our parents. In some ways, we're really divergent. And I think that's probably true of many people. But something we are finding, which I think maybe ties together several of these themes, is that intergenerational engagement between parents and kids seems to strengthen kids' convictions. Meaning, so like, for example, one of our projects right now is looking at impacts of agritourism, so kids getting onto farms for education or recreation, and how that might help them kind of shape their views of local food systems and what's important, and whether they think local foods are a good idea, and whether they're kind of supportive of local food systems and all of that. And what we found, which is we found similar trends in other projects, is that it's not so much what parents think about agriculture, it's just that they talk to their kids, period, right? Like about their schoolwork, about like that they're just involved in their kids' lives. And we saw that in Danielle's stuff around climate change. It's not so much what parents' views are about climate change, it's just that they talk to their kids about climate change or kind of about anything, right? And so I think that what we're seeing here is, whereas I'm mostly interested in kind of the power that kids can have in their families to kind of help shape conversations in new, potentially productive ways around contentious topics in particular. But I think that what parents are certainly playing a role in kind of empowering their kids to think critically and to kind of form their own opinions, which I think is kind of a neat dynamic. So it's not so much the intergenerational learning is not so much about mimicry as it is about giving kids the kind of agency and support they need to be able to interpret the world around them and, you know, talk about it, which I think it's a cool layer to all of this.
That is super neat. Thank you guys for your answers. I'm super excited. I'm sorry to my seminar planning team. I'm going to go a little off the rails here. I want to tug on this agritourism bit for a little bit. How it's been viewed as a strategy to increase the revenue of local farms, but it also has other benefits to the community. Dr. Stevenson, could you talk a little bit more about how agritourism can be used as an education tool, and if there are, I mean, I'm assuming there are familial impacts?
Yeah, so I can chat about that a little bit, both in the terms of kind of what we're hoping to find and what we're actually finding already. So you probably planted this question knowing kind of what we're involved in our lab, but we've got I'm involved in a USDA project where we're looking at educational and what we're calling market impacts of agritourism. So it's essentially when families go to farms for recreation or education, the kids learn about agriculture. In particular, we're looking at local food contexts, and are parents more willing to support it with their budgets. And so we're in the latter stages of that project. But a lot of our work was in schools, and as you might imagine, it's been a little challenging in a COVID context to get good data out of school settings. So we're still kind of working out the kids stuff. The parent data is by and large analyzed, at least for half of the project, pre-COVID, and we found some really encouraging things in there. Meaning, like when parents visit farms with their kids, that seems to be an impactful enough experience that we're seeing some shifts in both attitudes towards local foods. People think it's a good idea, like a better idea than when they started, but also their intended like purchasing behaviors, or there's an increase in that. So we aren't measuring actual dollars, but we're asking really pointed questions like, would you be willing to increase your monthly budget to support local foods? Would you be willing to go out of your way to farmers markets to support local foods? Would you be willing, you know, how much would you be willing to increase your family budget? And we found some really pretty encouraging results from that. The take-home message is parents come away more excited and more willing to support local foods. With the kids stuff, we're still sorting through it. I will say, like, anecdotally, a lot of people are, you know, like, it makes some theoretical sense that visiting farms, like it will help kids engage with agriculture. It employs a lot of the like best practices of place-based learning and hands-on learning. And anytime you can get direct experiences or interact with actual farmers, that seems to leave an impression on kids that has some lasting impact. So that's all encouraging. And a lot of farmers get into agriculture. Partly it is to diversify income. So it's to, like, you know, preserve family farms. They got to have, you know, they open up their barns for weddings, and they have agritourism because they can't make a living off of growing crops the way they normally would, like they had for generations. So some of it's just an economic decision, but a lot of farmers get really excited about it because they think, well, if we do this and we host people on our farm, they'll go away knowing more about agriculture. But we're just kind of getting into, I can't really speak to whether we're finding that or not, because because COVID, because we're still sorting through that data. but I guess I'll stop talking. But in just a second, I guess the analysis we have run is mostly on the pretest data, and some things that are coming out of that is one, the point that I was making before, when we're thinking about predictors of agricultural literacy, like apart from whether they go to a farm or not, just measuring agricultural literacy among kids. One important factor seems to be whether they talk to their parents about food related stuff, but just in general stuff like about their homework and stuff. Those kids seem better kind of primed to have higher agricultural literacy. And the other thing is whether they know a farmer or not, which I think is encouraging for the power of agritourism in building support for local foods and agricultural literacy among kids. And it goes right along with the themes that we were talking about. A lot of it is personal connections with parents or with other adults or with people in their support networks to kind of show them the ropes. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you for indulging me. So now I want to get back to our regularly scheduled programming and get back on this climate change topic. So the communication around climate change science has been contentious and riddled with misinformation for decades for both the general public and for kids. How has climate education for children changed over the years? And do you think the average curriculum is up to date with the science? And I really want to hear from Dr. Bush here.
Yeah, this is probably the one question that I can answer the most readily. So I'll definitely take that one up. So I have a thing to share. So I would say, I wish it were better. So far as K-12 education around climate change, it's been slow on the uptake. So you get amazing curricular projects like Kathryn and Danielle are running, but those are not the norm, right? It is not normal that teachers are spending weeks talking about climate change and the societal implications like Kathryn and Danielle's projects. So this is a recent, I just threw up in the chat, a recent study that was partnered with the National Center for Science Education. And they looked at all of the states' inclusion of climate change in the standards for K-12 education. There was an old study from like the 1990s that showed that it was really poor. So this is the most recent new one. And honestly, it's improved, but I would say that it's still not great. One of the ways that we're moving forward is that climate change is included in the next generation science standards, which are the science standards that are national. Although I say that with like some reticence because we don't have a national curriculum, we don't have national standards. It's up to each state then to adopt those NGSS, and some do and some don't, and some do, but they revise them. And in particular, the parts that they revise are the ones that center around climate change and evolution and all the air quotes, controversial science topics. So what this report was showing was that we have made some strides, but that's mainly a result of the NGSS. So the states that have adopted the NGSS get a B+ grade, which is still not an A. And then kind of, everything goes downhill from there. There are several states that were failing. And unfortunately, these are states that have huge student populations like Texas, right? Texas, California, and New York are some of our most student populous states. So it's still problematic. What they found are some of the same things that I found in my research as well of student textbooks, which is they're muddling the science. They are placing climate change as if it's in scientific debate. They are sometimes just ignoring it altogether. And then lastly, when they do talk about it, they don't talk about solutions. They don't talk about adaptation, and they don't talk about mitigation. So it leaves, so they talk about the problem and then, right, and then leave kids to figure it out. So like, there's no hope. There's no action. There's no call for action. There's no efficacy to help make them feel like they can make change. And I think that's problematic for youth. So, you know, as a whole, I don't think we're doing too well. But I think that you get like these great little shiny pockets of great work where you have either teachers that are really invested, or you have areas of the country that are really invested. Like I will hold up like Portland School District. They have a hardline policy where climate change materials cannot present climate change as controversial at all. And so, education is in the United States is not national, and it's not even, statewide really. It's very, very localized. And so you get kind of these great exemplars of maybe how it could be done, but on the whole, I think we're really not setting our youth up to be change makers.
And I think
go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say another part of it too, that I bring it up just because it's something that a project that we're starting this summer with some of the students in my lab and the Climate Change Education Collective, which Casey started, or she's part of the team that started that. But looking at almost we're calling it the State of the Union, so to speak, of climate change education prep for teachers in university institutions. Because it's important to remember that teachers are people. And just like people have a hard time, you know what I mean? We all have different opinions about things. So do they, and they have impossible standards that they're put up against to meet and to educate students, and they don't always have the right support to do things. And so we are going to be working on looking at how our universities prepping teachers to teach about some of these things, to integrate topics, to talk about things like diversity and justice through the lens of climate justice. So that's going to be interesting to see. There have been papers that have come out looking at just general university students and found that it's over half of them will never hear the word climate change while they're in university programming. So there's some work to be done there too. So I thought I'd throw that little nugget in there as well.
Sorry, Kay, can I jump in, Kathryn?
Yes, absolutely.
I think that's interesting, Danielle, and it makes me think. I wonder if Casey, you might have an opinion on this, or Norma. I'd be interested to hear how it is in your context too. But I think that, definitely. I think what strikes me as promising about that approach, to Casey's point, education is so localized, and it's also so beholden to kind of the political moment, right? And even just thinking of the work we've done with climate change ed in North Carolina over the last decade. I mean, the politics has shifted drastically over the last decade. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe not as drastically as it could, but the prospect of doing climate change education has brightened, has become a little bit more simple than it was when we first started, for sure. And I think some areas it's maybe opposite trends, some areas it's maybe to a larger degree. And it occurs to me that working with pre-service teachers is potentially a promising strategy because universities are hopefully a little bit more stable. They're certainly not beholden to political whims of the states that they're in, particularly public institutions. But at least we have at least guise of academic freedom, right? And hopefully we're guiding our own programs. So I guess I just want to offer that observation and get reactions to it, particularly from the perspective of people who are in colleges of education. And also, Norma, I'm curious to hear how this may be the same or different from your context.
Well, no. Yes, you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
Okay, look, for my opinion, all the words, they don't take this theme about climate change in serious. For me, it's very, very, very serious, this climate change. They don't pay attention for it. They have to start with university, schools, all organization is related to the science. Because if we like a personal working school, university, pay attention of this, it's going to change. Starting with kids, children, parents, students in the university, and all this. Because they talk about, for example, I'm going to use a Puerto Rico example. We have a class in curriculum, is not required to graduate. You take if you want. See, it's science, environmental science. They talk about this thing, about climate change, but they don't talk too much because they have to complete the curriculum in one semester. It's not enough. They don't have time for it. In elementary school, they talk just a little bit, but we need more than this that they're doing around the world. In USA, in Puerto Rico, we need more movement that make the wake up the people what's happening here in the world, around the world. It's not talking about, yes, I give you maybe an article talking about this. Yes, I read this, but a lot of people don't read this. We need to impact as more people we can impact, as more change we have it, as more care we have about the world, about the earth, about the change. And then I think if they start with kids, with kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, high school, university, doctoral, postdoctoral degree, talking about this, making investigation. With kids, you can go out and see and talk about the change. You don't have to do a lot because they are growing up. In Puerto Rico, we have, when I was in school, it's still doing, we have the students in high school have to complete 20 hours of green contact. We call green contact because you have to complete 20 hours with the natural. For example, the teacher bring the people to the seas, to clean the beaches, to clean the community about all the garbage they have it, and then they classify. For example, aluminum you can recycle, paper you can recycle, but there's another garbage that you cannot. They learning about this, but 20 hours for each is not too much. But it's making something about the responsibility for people. They also clean green areas, making gardens. We in our school, in my high school, the student from environmental science make a garden, and from the first they prepare the land until they have the harvest, and they know what happened when it's raining too much. They know what happened when it's too much sun. And it's very, very important that we make the difference, because right now we are here and we can make it, but we can make it together. Not like a community. Not okay, I do my work in Puerto Rico, you do your work right here, but if we get together and talk the same language, I think we can do too much. You want another? You want to talk about this? In Puerto Rico, we have a lot of change. We can dramatic change, because in 10 years ago, For example, in December, in November, we can plant, sometimes you can plant pineapple, you can plant tobacco, but right now, because the climate change, we have to change the time to plant, because sometime in October, rain, but not too much. But we have maybe 2 years ago that everything that we plant in October, we lost it because the rain. See? And it's because the climate change. It is.
Absolutely. So for the sake of time, I am going to ask Kate to come up and help me lead the audience questions portion of it, and then we'll sign off around 4 o'clock.
Absolutely. So we had a few really great questions from the audience. The first one I want to ask you all is for the entire panel. Are there certain intergenerational learning relationships that are more effective when transferring knowledge? And how do you account for the strength of personal connections between people invested in intergenerational learning exchange? For example, the dogs are 10 times more excited to see grandma compared to anyone else. Perhaps you'd be a better trainer. So anyone can take that if they'd like.
I'll start. I don't know that I have the answers. I think that my gut is probably in the spirit of this question, that's probably strength of relationship does matter. However, we've been digging, like just kind of scratching at that question just a little bit in some of our stuff. Primarily, we've been looking at, so with Danielle's work, we were looking at family influence, right? Kids to parents, which is obviously a very close relationship. And then in subsequent projects, we're starting to look at impacts on communities. And so it may be that the kids like may or may not know the adults, right? Or they may have like, you know, they just might be on their son's soccer team or something. And so it's more peripheral relationships. So far, we're not finding a lot of at least detectable differences in influences of whether the adults know the kids or not, which is a little surprising, but maybe encouraging. And I think is consistent with a narrative that at least is hypothesized and I'm kind of hopeful about, and that it may, with kids being, like when we're thinking about intergenerational, of kids to adults, it may just be kind of the figure of the child, right? That helps us kind of resonate with the children in our own lives. I think most adults find children compelling. And I think they're probably compelling because they make you either think of yourself as a child or about the children that are special in your lives. So it doesn't really answer your question, but I think it's a great one and one that we're excited to dig into more.
Just following up on that, it's the same thing. We don't really have the answer, but we're starting to investigate some of the other characteristics of how people view child and adult partnerships. There is a postdoc who's working in my lab. Her name is Dr. Teresa Melton, and she's trained formally in the positive youth development literature and focuses on child and adult partnerships. And so she's looking at child and adult attunement, regardless on how much they agree on an issue or how much they're on board and like the same playing field or how important things are. On different topics. They're also starting to look at how do adults view the influence of youth, because that definitely varies depending on cultural context and how you grew up and so on and so forth. So starting to get at some of that stuff, but I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, just like Kathryn was saying.
Yeah, right, because it's a question of mechanisms, right? So we know the what maybe, but not necessarily the why. And so these are all kind of like hypotheticals as to why we think this works.
Wonderful. All right, thank you all for that. We have another question from Dominique David Chavez. For rural and indigenous communities where elders and youth traditionally learn together on the land for generations, and where Western colonial education and culture has disrupted these intergenerational relationships, Where are the contemporary spaces where youth and elders are learning and sharing together about climate change? Where could we support and create more of these spaces where youth can lead climate resilience efforts?
That's a really interesting question in terms of where it's happening now. I don't know off the top of my head where it's currently happening, but based on what I'm seeing in the media, and I'm speaking from a very US-centric context right now, is that a lot of youth are forcing us to have these conversations. So they're bringing it back home. They're like, we want to have these conversations. You know, there are groups of youth that are suing the US government for infringing on their rights for not dealing with climate change. And I had a really interesting conversation with a colleague here at Penn State. Her name's Dr. Holly Kulago, and she's a member of the Diné tribe of the Navajo Nation in Arizona. And she said something very similar to me, that, you know, you think of the colonial practices where it's this idea of that you've got a sage on the stage. You've got this teacher who knows everything and they pass everything down. So it's this intergenerational learning from adults to children. But that other cultures and that other ways of knowing look at it that everyone has a life experience and everyone brings something to the table. So that's something that Dr. Kulago and I are going to start looking at and how it works with intergenerational learning specifically. In terms of supporting it, I tell people all the time, like, talk to kids, listen to kids, and give them spaces to have those conversations. All of us, especially Kathryn and I, and the work that we've done, just because I'm most familiar with it, is that we've had different versions of kids and adults interacting together, but really it's just this providing this platform to have those interactions. And doing it by bringing that part into the traditional science curriculum in K through 12 settings. But that's about what I have right now. I don't really know of a ton of places where it's happening. I don't know, Kathryn, Casey, Norma, if you have different things to add to that, but that's what I've got.
There's a comment in the chat. Joy, I don't know you, but I imagine you may have some more stories than we do. I can think of a couple of things, but she referenced a book that she was talking about, intergenerational conversations around climate change. I guess off the top of my head, I think there have been some cool models coming out, just bringing adults and kids together in more informal spaces too, which I know is more Casey's thing, which she can maybe chat more about. But I think just community organizations like museums or libraries provide a lot of opportunity for that. But I think I also just really just want to say that I appreciate the premise of the topic, and the point is well taken, and I think a really important one to keep in mind. I'm curious to hear what Norma's reactions are to this too.
Yeah, I think we can make more activity with the parents, students, and community. We can make, for example, like we did in Sidra. We explain what the project is about there, so they can know why we are doing this activity. Because sometimes you try to involve the community and the students and the parents and the elders, because you have to do it. But if you tell the people, it's not you have to do it, it just let's work together for us, not for you, not for me, for our family, for our community, for our island, for our nation. You have to talk to the people about this, not because you have to do it, it's because it's going to help all together. They're going to help you if we do an activity, for example, in the farm. We can get all the family and go and plant. Not it's because you have to do it, because you tell the people you have to do it, they don't go to do a good job. But if you tell the people we are going to do this because it's good for us, the children can understand that. The parents can understand. All the community is going to work together for benefit everybody. And then if you make activity also in the school, look in the, I was, my daughter have my son, I mean my grandson in the school, and then they have an activity all month. We like grandparents, we went to the room to the students. Maybe it was 15 students because it was a private school, and then we share the stories. We read the story for these children. The children's they look so interesting to learn, but they learn because they get interest because it's not a formal. See, they see that, okay, history, I like history, so I want to hear history, and then they pay attention to it. But if you do something like too much formal, like for example, in school you have to take chemical, and if you don't take this, you don't pass to the, you don't graduate. But why you don't explain people what the chemical, why you have to take chemical, why you have to take history? History is very important. And the people say, no, I'm going to study science. I don't need history. Why I need history? And other people say, I'm going to I want to finish my 12th grade and graduate. Why you have to give me so math? You need math. You need math wherever you go, because you have to know how to sum 2 plus 2 is 4. If you don't like math, you have to study, because you need on your entire life. You need history, you need science, you need all the class that they give in the school, but you have to explain why you have to take this class. It's happening right now with the parents, with the elders, with the children that grow up, with the youth. Explain why they have to do it. Don't push them to do this, because they're going to understand. They don't want to do it. My gosh, this is my favorite part, school and students.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I think that's all the time we have for questions from the audience. So Kathryn, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Kate. So I want to thank everyone for being here today, audience and our panelists. Can we get a virtual round of applause? Yeah, thank you.
I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you all so much for being here and our wonderful panelists. This was absolutely fantastic. And